DeWardrick, this is an interesting development here for sure, and it's one that's been driving markets a lot. But this latest escalation seems to throw at least more complexity into an already complex trade discussion around the world. What exactly does it mean when China says, don't take sides against us?
Good morning to you, Dom. Look, I think when it comes to China's concerns, it is that they're going to be completely encircled and contained when it comes to economics and trade. That's the one big fear that they have. And Dom, I think the important thing for other countries, in particular some vulnerable countries, which we can discuss to hear here, is that China will not allow for these 90 days of reciprocal negotiations with the Trump administration to somehow harm China's interests. And they were very clear about this rhetorically, Dom. I think that the Chinese right now are barking much louder than they hope to bite, because their diplomatic strategy here, Dom, is to paint the U.S. as the trade bully, the unreliable partner. And so China coming in hard with sticks, I think, undermines its carrot strategy for diplomacy.
You know, DeWardrick, in a prior life, you served with the Defense Department during the Obama administration. I wonder, from a strategic standpoint, you can look at this economically, but you can also look at this from a U.S. national security standpoint. How exactly does the global hegemony race, I guess, if you will, right, Cold War version 2.0, you pick sides either with China or the U.S., how exactly does that play out with regard to policy, from not just an economic perspective, but from a defense one over the course of the next several, call it months and quarters at this point?
Yeah, this is a very good question, Don. Let me start with a baseline in terms of what I heard frequently every time we engaged any country, but particularly countries in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific area. They do not want to be forced to choose between the U.S. and China in any sort of scenario, economics, geopolitical. And so you constantly heard this refrain that we do not want to be forced to choose. But I think, Don, we're reaching a point now where that sort of hedge, that sort of threading of the needle is becoming less and less possible. Trade is becoming more fragmented, and certainly the geopolitical race, the national security elements of that race right now is forcing countries to decide who they want to side with. But this is a real pain point for many countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, who I think is sitting at the apex of this battle between the U.S. and China at the moment.
How exactly does it play out from a economic or company perspective, right? We talk about some of the names with exposure to Chinese markets, to global trade in general. Does it mean then that countries in certain parts of the world will either have to use different companies from, say, China or the U.S.? And by extension, do consumers in those countries then have to start thinking about how they want their respective governments to either reward or penalize certain foreign entities?
Well, you know, back when 2018 or so, Dom, and certainly throughout the Biden administration, you started to have this strategy of in whatever country for that country. But that's difficult for many businesses to maintain. But I think we may be looking at a situation where supply chains are going to be heavily localized or regionalized, and companies are going to have to adjust to that. Because I think for the U.S. in particular, you know, 46% is what Vietnam would be charged if they can't cut a deal, with 145% of goods coming in from China. I mean, those numbers are just incredible for consumers to absorb, for businesses to absorb. So we're going to have to figure out in this new era how supply chains are restructured. And I think, unfortunately, Don, for some time it's going to be chaotic, but over the long run, we may see greater localization in terms of supply chain, greater regional trade versus trans-Pacific or transatlantic type trade routes.